Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and this is going to be a part B to our 10th part of the series on double action, single action autoloaders. In particular, we are covering myths associated with guns, and I wanted to take a separate video for one particular myth that deserves a little bit more attention, and that is the myths, I should say, there's multiple ones here, but the myths that are associated with lubricating a gun. The myth usually takes one extreme or the other. One form of the myth, or one myth, is that guns should not be oiled at all. And then the other side of the coin is that there's no such thing as over-oiling your gun. And like I discussed in the last video, when it comes to these kinds of myths, what makes them myths is that they're stated as blanket statements that supposedly apply to everything, and they usually don't. They are usually true in a particular context to a certain degree, but they usually don't apply universally to everything. And this one is no different. As to the whole idea that you should never ever oil your gun at all, it is certainly true that there are guns out there that people are running without any oil, any applied lubrication, externally applied lubrication whatsoever. Basically just ran out of the box and they keep running them that way. For example, Tim from the Military Arms channel has an AR, a direct gas impingement AR, that he's pretty happy with, he's pretty proud of, and he doesn't really do anything to it. And it runs just fine. Now, of course, if you watch his stuff, you know that there's a lot of other ARs that he's had that maybe don't always run quite so great, etc., etc. But that particular one, it has run just fine, and it doesn't have any additional lubrication applied to it. And so it is true that you can run some guns under certain conditions without any oil and be just fine. And then on the other extreme of the situation, you have people that have literally doused their guns in motor oil, put them in a tub, pour motor oil on top of them, take them out, and they fire. At least as long as they have them on screen. But they take them out and they fire, and they do just fine, even with that great quantity of oil on them. Larry Vickers, for example, did that in a video. Forget what the title of the video was, but he did that basically talking about the myth of over-oiling guns, and no, it's not possible, etc., etc. And in that particular test that he did, which wasn't super extensive, he just ran 10 rounds through each of the guns that he did this with, that he dumped in a vat of oil, basically. It worked, and so there is a certain amount of truth to the statement that you can't over-oil a gun. But of course the issue is the types of guns that are at play, and of course the conditions under which they are being operated. When it comes to the AR that Tim from the Military Arms channel is dealing with, you're dealing with a gun that is somewhat unique. The particular AR that he's talking about is, well, ARs in general, we'll start there, have a fairly circular bolt carrier. And the place in which they operate in the gun is a fairly circular tube, except that this fairly circular tube has some rectangular cutouts above it and below it. And if you're dealing with an AR that has loose enough tolerances, what will happen is any grit and grime that gets into the tube part can be worked out, either pushed up or down, into those more rectangular pieces of the upper and lower receiver, respectively, such that those excess debris no longer become an issue. And so excess debris, as long as it doesn't become too much in too short of a span of time, won't significantly slow down the gun. So as long as the ingress of debris isn't at a very high rate, and you have a gun that has loose enough tolerances and places in the receiver, places in the action of the gun that dirt and grime can get pushed into, yeah, lubrication is not going to be an overly huge concern a lot of times. And you add on top of that the fact that a lot of the blowback that you get from that kind of a situation, from firing a gun. A lot of the gases that are going to be piped back, especially into a direct impingement sort of system, are going to have a lot of carbon in them, and carbon is actually a mild lubricant in and of itself. It's not necessarily as good as a lot of oils, but it does have a mild lubricating kind of effect. And so if you're dealing with the right kind of tolerances combined with the fact that that carbon buildup actually can have a lubricating effect as long as the excess works off, and you're working under conditions in which a lot of exterior dirt and grime and whatnot is not being introduced into the weapon, yeah, you can actually get away without any oil just fine. Another issue to deal with when it comes to oil, another reason why we oil guns in the first place, has to do with corrosion protection. And oiling a gun to the point of being able to protect it from incidental corrosion actually doesn't take a whole lot of oil. All that you have to do is wipe enough oil on the gun for it to take a shine, and then wipe it off. And the residual that it's left when you do that, you put a little bit of oil on the gun, make sure it takes a shine that you can actually see, wipe it off with an oily rag so you're not completely cleaning it off, not stripping it, but wiping off enough that it's not shiny anymore. That little microscopic film that you leave on there will be enough for most incidental contact with things that might otherwise corrode it. So like your fingers that may be sweaty or something like that, which to a large extent is salt water, and salt water can be really hard on guns. That little thin layer of oil that's left after you take that shine off is enough to prevent most incidental corrosion. But the thing is that a lot of modern guns have a lot of coatings that have been applied to them, like melanite and things like this, and nitride coatings and all these cool things, that prevent a lot of incidental wear and tear just in and of themselves. And so for a lot of guns, if they have good coatings on them, they have the right tolerances, they have open spaces in the action that dirt and grime can get pushed into, and not too much dirt and grime is getting pushed into them from outside sources, a lot of guns can do just fine without oil, as long as they're run under those conditions. They're not run too hard, they're not run in overly adverse environments, they have fairly loose tolerances, open spaces in the gun itself, etc., etc. As long as they're run under those conditions, yeah, oil isn't overly necessary. But the interesting thing about that is that a lot of people are under the impression that you do need to have oil in your gun, and and oftentimes a fairly large amount of it. And when you look at people who are like that, they're usually people that either are currently or have been firearms instructors. So Mike from Mr. Guns and Gear has mentioned that the times where he's seen guns fail the most often is when they're not properly lubricated. But he's also speaking as someone who used to be a former firearms instructor. John Lavelle, I believe is his name. I'm terrible with names, and that's why I'm saying it. It's not that I'm not familiar with his stuff. I've watched a lot of his stuff. I'm just terrible with last names. And so, John, if I get your last name wrong, I apologize. But I think it's John Lavelle or John Lovell or something like that. But he also mentions that he doesn't really like to clean his guns a whole lot, but he does oil them very frequently. And then John Correa from the Active Self-Protection channel, and by the way, John Lovell or Lovell or whatever it is the Warrior Poet Society. That is his internet handle. Active Self-Protection is John Correa, and John Correa has also mentioned he's not overly big on cleaning his striker-fired guns, but he is very much so adamant that they be properly lubricated. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there's Larry Vickers, who did the let's drench this thing in oil test on his guns there. And he is also of the same opinion that these people that come to their classes for instruction in guns and whatnot, they really need to oil their guns more. And so you get the extremes out there, and there's documentation for each one. Each of them provides documentation, and they show, hey, here's a gun that's been completely soaked in motor oil and it still runs, and here's a gun that hasn't had any oil on it in like forever, and hundreds and even thousands of rounds, and it's doing just fine. And people are saying, when I see guns fail on the line, it's because they're not properly lubricated. And these are actual firearms instructors, and you're looking at all this going, what on earth is going on here? Guns can run completely fine without oil. Guns fail because they don't have oil. Both statements can't be true. What's going on? Well, in the case of guns that run okay without oil, I already explained what's going on there. It's a combination of space in the action of the gun combined with good tolerances that push excess material out of the way, also with a relatively small ingress of foreign particulate matter, combined with a system that introduces a mild lubricant into the gun itself. Direct gas impingement guns like AR-15s will do that. They feed the gas right back into the main action of the gun, and that does act as a mild lubricant. It can work. But when we're talking about all these firearms instructors, and all of them are saying, oil the gun, oil the gun, oil the gun, they're operating in a different environment. The guns that they're dealing with range. Not all the guns that they're dealing with, because they're instructing classes and classes with multiple people in them, not all the guns are going to be exactly the same. They're often dealing with whatever the student happens to bring to the class. And it might be an AR-15 that has fairly loose tolerances and those kinds of things, or it might not. It may be a hand gun that is really tight on its tolerances and kind of finicky, or very loose and it can't hold a group worth beans, but you can cycle anything through it and it's going to run just fine. They can get pretty much anything showing up to class. And so for them, making a one-size rule that fits all has to incorporate a lot more. Another thing that you have to deal with when you're talking about these people that are firearms instructors is that they're often usually dealing with a fairly large volume of fire. A lot of self-defense type classes that they would run minimally are going to require the students to run at least 100 rounds, a lot of times more than that, especially if you're doing specific tactical drills and whatnot, or a multi-day kind of training session. But minimally, they're going to expect their students to bring 100 rounds of ammunition with them and fire all 100 rounds of ammunition. That's the bottom line. That's the minimum that they're going to do. The minimum that they're going to require of their students. And 100 rounds is actually quite a bit. And a lot of guns that people carry, that people own and whatnot, cannot go through 100 rounds, frankly, without a little bit of help. And that's where their emphasis on oil comes from. You get guns that don't have necessarily the best tolerances in the world. You put a lot of dirt and grime through them in a relatively short amount of time. And then a lot of times these instructors are working in outdoor environments. So a lot of firearms instructors prefer outdoor ranges. And the outdoor ranges that they work in a lot of times are oftentimes basically gravel pits. And so you get a lot of foreign debris, a lot of dust and dirt in the air at gravel pits and environments that are like that. And frankly, I've seen it in my own shooting. There have been days that I've gone out to the place where I usually shoot. It's in a spot that is called the South Hills in Idaho. And out there, sometimes the weather is real nice and there's not a whole lot of wind or anything like that. And there's very few particulates in the air, and you can run just about any gun pretty well up there, and even quite a few rounds through it. But I have had cases with particular guns that, first of all, are kind of finicky to begin with, combined with days in which the wind really kicks up and there's a lot of activity in the area that's kicking up a lot of dirt. For example, back behind where I shoot, there's a bunch of ATVs over there, or people who will ride ATVs behind me. Not in the direction that I'm shooting, obviously, but behind me people will run ATVs back and forth all across a little dirt road, and it kicks up a ton of dirt, and if the wind's blowing, it gets carried over to where I am, and it gums everything up. And there are a lot of guns that will fail under those conditions. Like I said, they're usually kind of finicky guns to begin with, but you add that environmental debris into that kind of environment, and it's going to cause problems. There are at least 2 of my guns that I have gotten to malfunction that way. Not that it's a good thing that they malfunction that way, but it's one of those things that if you run anything long enough and hard enough, eventually you can get it to malfunction. In particular, I've done that with my Kel-Tec PMR30. Like I said, it's already kind of a finicky gun, and I've talked about that in other videos. But on dusty days, when there's a lot of particulate matter in the air, it does not do very well at all. And then my CZP-09, which is normally a pretty good gun, if it's an especially a bad day regarding particulates in the air, it can seize up pretty quickly. And I've experienced that as well. If I run a lot of rounds through it on a day that's not very good in terms of dust and particulates in the air, I can get it to fail. But again, that's in cases where the normal soot and grime and carbon buildup that's happening in the gun is getting combined with foreign debris from the environment, and that mixture is what's slowing the gun down. Like I said, in and of itself, the carbon from the firing of the rounds themselves usually isn't that big of a thing, as long as there's places in the gun for the excess to move to, and as long as the action is such that it shows the excess out of the way. But in some guns, they're not very good at shoving the excess out of the way. There's not really any spot in the gun for that to happen. And then on top of that, if you start introducing foreign debris into that carbon buildup, then yeah, it's not going to act as a lubricant anymore. And the dust in my area that I'm talking about where I go shooting, it's basically clay, and it's been ground very, very, very fine. And clay is absolutely awful as a lubricant. It does not lubricate very well at all. And if you get that into the gun, yeah, it's going to cause things to seize up and do all kinds of weird things. So the end of the matter on that one is it's going to depend on the environment in which you're operating it. And that's why a lot of these firearms instructors are very adamant that their students make sure that they really oil their guns before they bring them in, so that they can get through this firing session without any major problems. Now, the extent that they take it to, of saying that, it's basically impossible to over-oil a gun, well, that's actually not true either, and I have seen this myself. Believe me, it is very much so possible to over-oil a gun, and sometimes it's more so design specific to particular kinds of guns, but it is definitely possible to over-oil a gun. And the main culprit is usually the firing pin channel on various guns. This happens a lot with striker-fired guns, but it can happen with just about any gun that is out there that doesn't have a vented firing pin channel. What am I talking about? Well, in pretty much any gun, you're going to have a firing pin channel or a striker channel or something like that. And it's basically a tube that is sitting behind where the bullet sits that holds the firing pin. And at the end of the tube, there's going to be a little itty-bitty hole for the firing pin to stick through. But the rest of the tube is actually usually fairly large, and that's because the firing pin itself is actually a fairly large diameter, and it tapers down to the little needle point that winds up hitting the primer on the bullet, or cartridge, I should say. So you have the fairly large tube, little tiny hole at the end, and the back end of this tube has the firing pin in it. The front end of the tube is technically open most of the time until it comes time to fire, and then the little end of the firing pin sticks through it just a little bit, and then there's usually some kind of a spring or momentum or something that'll pull it back out. But what can happen with this firing pin channel is that oil can get inside of it, especially from the side of the little opening in the front. You can also get some seepage from the back end as well. And this is a major problem with striker-fired guns, because on striker-fired guns, the back opening isn't on the back of the gun. Instead, it's underneath the slide. And so if you're spraying oil in there or dripping oil in there, it's going to get into the firing pin channel because it's directly exposed on the back end right there. But you can get entry on either side of the firing pin. And as long as things are fairly slow, in that the gun is actively firing right then, the oil is going to do what all liquids do, and that is flow. So if you get oil on the back end of the firing pin, it'll seep down through the little crevices into that little pocket between the firing pin and that little hole. Or if the oil is coming from the front side, it can get in there, and you'll get a little pool of oil inside the front end of that firing pin channel. And most of the time, because the gun isn't firing most of the time, you're not going to notice anything, and it's going to be business as usual. But if you've got a buildup of oil in that empty hollow spot in the firing pin channel, and you go to fire the gun, well, the firing pin is going to come forward, and it's going to come into contact with that little blob of oil that's sitting there. And it's going to push on that oil, and it's going to try to compress that oil and move it out of the way. But the problem, though, is that the openings that the oil has to escape through are fairly small. There's a little itty-bitty tiny pinprick hole in the front of the firing pin channel, but that's not very big, and the firing pin itself is going to be trying to move through there, so there's not a lot of extra space there. And then some of the oil might try to get squished back, but that's where the main firing pin is. So there's no real place for this oil to go. Now, if it had enough time, it could eventually seep out one way or the other, but when a firing pin moves under force from the hammer or under force from the striker, it's moving pretty quick. There's not enough time for it to seep and go somewhere else. So instead you have the firing pin hitting this blob of oil, which either dramatically slows it down or sometimes just outright stops it. And the result that you get is the firing pin either won't come out of its channel like it's supposed to, or it'll just come out just a little itty bitty bit, and you'll get a light primer strike. Okay, so over-oiling a gun is something that you actually can do, and the primary area where you're going to see this is in the firing pin channel. Most of the other parts of a gun you can oil the snot out of, and it's not going to hurt anything. You know, like on a handgun, oiling up the slides, you can pour a lot of oil on there, and excess is just going to bleed off, flow away from it, and it's not really going to do anything. Even on a lot of the internals of the gun, the different sears and connections and cams and those kinds of things, a lot of the excess oil is just going to flow out, and you might have a little puddle of oil underneath the gun after you've let it set for a little while, but it's not really going to be over-oiled, except in a place where you can get oil into it, but you can't quickly get it out of, like the firing pin channel. Now, there are some guns that realize that this is a possibility, and they've actually developed firing pin channels that have little vent holes in them so that oil can seep out fairly quickly and be pushed out of the way very easily. For example, as far as I can tell, my CZP-10C actually has a little front at the front end of the firing pin channel, and as far as I can tell, that vent is there just specifically for that purpose of allowing excess oil to escape, which is actually a really smart design move on their part. But that's, of course, not the case with all guns. A lot of guns, they don't do that, and you have to be careful about that. You can oil pretty much any part on a gun that you want to, but be really careful around the firing pin channel. So is it true that there is no such thing as over-oiling a gun? Not quite. You want to be really careful around the firing pin channel. Other than that, usually not too bad, but you want to be careful around there. And is it true that any gun can go without oil and that you shouldn't oil the gun too much at all? Well, that's not really true either. Depending on the conditions, if you're running it under fairly hard conditions, especially with a lot of particulates that the gun is going to encounter, oil becomes a really good thing at that point. And it can be just a dusty environment, which I've experienced, and a lot of people that go to specific training ranges, which are kind of like gravel pits, they'll experience that. But even people who are concealed carrying will sometimes experience that as well, because if you're carrying concealed either in a pocket or inside the waistband holster or something like that, there tends to be a lot of lint from your clothing, and also, frankly, a lot of dead skin cells that winds up getting mixed into the operation of the gun. And like I said, the carbon buildup from the rounds fired themselves is usually not that big of a deal as long as it gets pushed out of the way. But if that starts mixing with other things like lint and dead skin cells and things like that, then you could have a major problem on your hands, and you could get some kind of a malfunction, stoppage, something along those lines. And so even for concealed carry, oil then becomes a pretty big issue, and it's a good idea to inspect your firearm from time to time that you use for concealed carry. Of course, empty it, but then go ahead and inspect it and actually check it out and see if you're getting lint and dust and stuff built up on it. We really usually want to be able to identify dead skin cells as dead skin cells. A lot of times we just think of it as dust, but that's actually what it is. A lot of times it is dead skin cells, but we'll call it dust because that's a little bit more friendly. But inspect your firearm from time to time and check for buildup. And this also gets into another issue that people are concerned about when it comes to lubrication. People are concerned that if they over-lubricate their gun, that the oil is going to mix with various debris, including the gunpowder residue and various particulates in the air, lint, and those kinds of things. It's going to get all mixed up, and it's basically going to form a lapping compound that will wear out the gun from the inside. And there is a certain amount of truth to that. But the solution to that problem is fairly simple. If you're afraid that this grime is going to build up in your gun, and as the gun cycles, that grime is going to start dragging along the metal and wearing it out, because that's what they mean by lapping compound. That's what lapping compound does. It's kind of a paste that you apply to metal parts that you want to smooth out against each other. And so it actually wears the two parts down next to each other so that their connection is nice and tight. That's what lapping compound does. And you can get that effect in guns if you have some kind of a base for extra particulates to get mixed into. But that doesn't necessarily require oil. The carbon residue from the cartridges themselves going off, if they don't get pushed out of the harm's way, basically, that can happen with that as well. The carbon residue from firing the gun will actually have a little bit of moisture in it. Most explosions actually result in a little bit of moisture. That's just a byproduct of the chemical process of burning pretty much any kind of fuel is going to release a certain amount of H2O, a certain amount of water. And so you've got a bit of carbon mixed with water, and anything else that gets mixed into that, if it's not getting pushed out of the way, it's going to have that same lapping compound effect. And so you can get that effect even if you don't oil the gun. But anytime you have some kind of things that things can get mixed into, yeah, that's always going to be a possibility, and you can wear out the gun from the inside out when that happens. But like I said, the solution to it is pretty simple. And the solution is simply this: clean your gun. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't clean their gun nearly as often as they should. And when they clean the gun, they don't always do it as thoroughly as they should. And I'm not saying that you have to do a white glove cleaning all the time and those kinds of things, but the main idea is to be getting out the excess. So you apply your cleaning liquid, whatever kind of cleaning liquid you use, to the gun. Make sure, okay, scrub things loose and all those kinds of things. You know, take your nylon brush and scrub things loose. And then, and this is the important part, take some kind of a rag, t-shirt material. Actually, it works real well. Just cotton t-shirt material. Cut it into little squares, whatever, and wipe out the excess material. You don't have to get it white glove clean, but wipe out any buildup. And then apply lubrication as you deem necessary after you've wiped out all the excess, and then you're good to go. But the idea is to keep wiping excess out of the gun, and as long as you do that, you won't get the buildup of that material. You won't have the lapping compound effect where it starts wearing out the gun from the inside out, and you'll be okay. Now, how often do you need to do this? It really depends on the gun and the conditions under which it is commonly used. If you have a gun that is normally kept in the gun safe, you're not going to have to clean it very often. It's not exactly being exposed to the elements all that often. But if you have like a concealed carry gun, well, you're going to have a lot of lint, you're going to have those dead skin cells floating around and those kinds of things. And if you carry the gun without having cleaned it from the last time you went to the range, then like I said, that carbon buildup in the gun, usually going to have a little bit of moisture in it because that's just a byproduct of burning fuel. You mix that with lint, you mix that with dead skin cells and whatnot, yeah, that'll build up and become pretty grody. But if you clean the gun before you start carrying it, it's not going to be as big of an issue because you're not going to have something to for that dirt to mix into, so that'll help you out a little bit there. But so start out with a clean gun for your next series of carry before you go to the range again. And then I would say once a week, once a month, somewhere in there, go ahead and inspect the gun and check it for buildup of lint and other debris. And if it's starting to look a little grody, go ahead and clean the thing. Put some cleaner on it of one kind or another. Make sure you wipe out the excess, loosen it up and then actually physically wipe out the excess somehow. Like I said, it doesn't have to be white glove clean, but wipe out the excess. Reapply your lubricants as you deem necessary and move on. That is basic, generally good advice for most handguns. Most handguns that I've seen today are designed to use more lubricant than not, just to be honest, especially if you're talking about high volume of fire in a single outing. If you plan on firing 50 rounds or less, you don't really need that much lubricant. But if you plan on firing more than that, it's a good idea to make sure that your gun has a decent amount of oil on it. But make sure that you don't get any oil into the firing pin channel, because that will definitely stop up a gun. Yes, it is possible to over lubricate a gun, and that there are certain places in the gun that you really shouldn't have much lubricant. The firing pin channel is definitely one of those places. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot that you can do with oil that's going to mess it up. And realize that there are a lot of environments, including carrying on your person, that will introduce foreign debris, and as that foreign debris builds up, it can cause problems. Clean your gun regularly. So running guns without oil is not something I would typically recommend. There are a lot of guns that, if they're run lightly enough in a clean enough environment, it's not going to be a major issue at all. And Tim's AR-15 from the Military Arms channel proves that pretty well. On the other end of it, if you want to apply a bunch of lubrication, as long as you stay away from the firing pin channel, you're probably not going to run into any major issues there, and it will allow your gun to run through a lot more rounds in a single sitting. And this is what all of the major firearms instructors out there are very adamant about, like Larry Vickers and John Correa and John Lavelle and Mike from Mr. Guns and Gear. Got to get these people straight. All of them would say lubricate the thing, because if you're going to run a lot of rounds through it, and especially in a fairly dirty environment, and you want it to keep working, that's kind of what you need. Alright, so I hope that cuts through kind of the back and forth that goes out there, and I hope that we realize that it is an issue of the kinds of guns that are at play, the amounts of things that are at play, and of course the environment in which they're operating. Take all that into account and you'll do just fine. Okay, like I said, oil is not a bad thing in and of itself, as long as you remember to clean the gun periodically and get rid of that foreign debris that's going to ingress into the oil, but it also can ingress into the just the carbon buildup. It can ingress into that as well. So regularly clean the gun, oil as much as you like, but stay away from the firing pin channel, and make sure you keep checking on the gun for any extra buildup. That's basically it. Thank you guys for your time and attention. Bye-bye.